Welcome to Thursday of Cisco Live. My name is Kyle Winters. I am a technical advocate focused on security in the Learning and Certifications group. And today I want to talk to you about malware. We're going to cover and give you an understanding of some of its tactics and basics, but we're going to start first with a brief history of malware and a better understanding of what malware actually is and the different types that are out there. Cover a brief history. It's not going to include every little bit of history that exists about malware, but just to kind of give you an idea of how it's evolved over time, and then compare that to the current malware landscape as well. Then we're going to cover common malware behaviors and techniques to give you an idea of how this malware is actually working. And then we're actually going to take a look at the Ryuk Ransomware, sort of crack it open a little bit and kind of go into how it works to give you an idea of how a real piece of malware is leveraging all of these different behaviors and techniques that are common across malware in the industry. We'll close with just a quick summary on different types of tools that are available to analyze and defend against malware. Just a quick housekeeping item. Inside of the WebEx, we do have a WebEx team space for this, so feel free to join if you'd like, ask questions later on. I'll post some slides, the slides that we're covering today, inside of that channel as well, so you can access it. You don't have to worry about taking pictures or anything if you don't want to. Those slides will be available to you later. And one quick, fun, important disclaimer is that this is all for educational purposes. Please do not go and write your own malware, preferably, after the session. We intend this presentation for educational purposes, not to necessarily encourage you to build your own malware. So make sure if you are doing anything like that for some reason that you're doing it in an approved legal way. So just to kind of start really quick, what is malware for those of you who might not know? It's short for malicious software. It's really any piece of software that's intended to cause damage or disrupt systems. It's not the good stuff, it's the bad stuff, really put it simply. But the reality is that not all malware is the same. There's a lot of different types of malware that exist, and some of these terms you've probably heard before. You might think that they're interchangeable, but they actually have different meanings. So for example, a virus is a malicious piece of code that attaches itself to a clean file and spreads to other files. It can do things like delete files, disrupt systems, cause operational issues. You've also got worms, which is a standalone malware that's really intended to replicate itself and spread to other computers as quickly and effectively as possible. Trojans are ones that consider like the Trojan horse, designed to look like legitimate software, but it's actually malicious software under the hood. You've got things like ransomware as well that are encrypting files and demanding ransom to decrypt those files. Spyware that's monitoring user behavior and sending that upstream somewhere. Things like adware as well too that can display unwanted ads in the browser. So these are all different types of malware. They don't all function the same, and they don't all have the same intended purposes. Now, when it comes to kind of the life cycle, the typical life cycle of a malware attack, there's several different phases to it in most cases. It starts with reconnaissance, where they're going to be gathering information about the target that they intend to attack. Then becomes that initial infection or the delivery of that payload. It can be done through phishing, some kind of exploit, drive-by downloads. We'll talk a little bit more about those here shortly. But once you have that initial infection, really execution becomes the next phase of just running that target payload of that malware. From there, usually malware tries to establish persistence so that way it can maintain a foothold inside of whatever system it's compromised. And then it does things like command and control function, so it can communicate from that infected host out to some kind of malicious actor who's controlling these different types of devices, telling the malware how to behave. And then from there, it can also oftentimes move laterally to other devices as well. Worms are very good at doing that, but the more devices that you infect, the more damage you can cause. Oftentimes they try to do things like privilege escalation as well. So it might be running initially as whatever user it can gain access to, but it's going to try very, very hard to get to root privilege so that way it can get as strong of a foothold and do as much damage as possible. Oftentimes, once it's done all of this, there's usually some kind of action or objective that it's trying to achieve. Maybe it's data exfiltration. Maybe it's what a piece of ransomware would do and encrypt and hold up a ransom note. But oftentimes, a very common one, let's just say for this example, is data exfiltration. It's going to try to extract data out, and then it's going to try to clean up after its own tracks, so that way people don't recognize and can't catch it as quickly as possible, don't realize that they've been compromised. So this is kind of the typical life cycle of a malware attack. And just to kind of lay it out a little bit differently, what an attack sequence might look like, it might start with a well-tailored email. Maybe it's a spear phishing attempt, which is targeting a specific individual to gain access into their system. From there, though, it's going to essentially, when you click on that link in an email, make a DNS query to a questionable site, potentially malicious site, to get a piece of malware or some kind of file to download. It's going to essentially start some kind of strange process in the back end to get the necessary information that it's looking for. And then it's going to, once it's installed that piece of malware, do its necessary payload process. It might look for other devices out in the network. It might try to steal data, as an example. So this is just an example of what one attack sequence might look like. So a brief history of malware. This is not going to be a full holistic history, but we're going to cover some key points really quick, just to kind of give you an idea of how malware has evolved over time. Really, it kind of starts in 1988 with the Morris worm. This is really kind of the first known piece of malware that exists, and that's actually it on that floppy disk right there. It was created by this man, Robert Morris, from Cornell University in the United States. And what it did is essentially exploited a bug inside of SendMail to be able to replicate itself and spread across systems. Now, at the time, it spread to 6,000 computers, which in 1988 was actually a significant amount of computers. So it disrupted universities and military sites through this. It was really kind of the first worm that came out that was known publicly. And that kind of started this whole malware trend from there. So a pivotal moment, to say the least. But over time, malware began to evolve, and we jump forward to 2003 with the SQL Slammer. This one spread rapidly across the internet. It exploited a buffer overflow in Microsoft SQL Server, and it sent essentially small UDP packets to random IPs on a specific port. In about 10 minutes, it infected 75,000 devices. So it spread very quickly. It did things like disrupt ATMs, airline ticketing, emergency services, and they estimated the damage from this to be about $1 billion. So at this point in time, it became clear, like, there's now an importance to make sure that you're regularly patching and updating your systems to avoid these types of bugs that can exist, these exploits. Moving forward to 2007 was the Zeus Trojan. This one is essentially done through phishing emails and drive-by downloads. It was exploiting browser vulnerabilities, and it bundled in exploit kits as well as part of it. Essentially, it stole banking credentials and used keystroke logging to disrupt essentially the financial institutions around the world. It also created botnets and did distributed denial of service attacks as well. So it led to ultimately the theft of millions of bank accounts, millions of dollars from bank accounts. And this was kind of a pivotal moment where now we're taking an approach less from disruption, more to financial incentive. So an interesting kind of shift now occurring in malware. People are seeing this as an opportunity to make money. And even further kind of shift that occurred as well too was in 2010 with Stuxnet. This essentially impacted industrial control systems in Iran. It was believed to be done by nation-state actors. So this was kind of now a pivotal point where malware is being used to essentially wage warfare with other countries. It targeted these Iranian nuclear facilities, and it helped essentially to destroy about 1,000 centrifuges through the infection of these industrial control systems. So now malware is not just being seen as a financial means to gain money, but a means of warfare as well too. Cyber war essentially now becoming a more household topic. You've got Emotet as well. That came about in 2014. And this kind of took things a little bit further as well, diving into leveraging multiple pieces of malware and combining those together to achieve different outcomes. Really, this one was about financial disruption as well too. But this was very unique in the sense that it was leveraging multiple different types of attack vectors, becoming a lot more complex, these pieces of malware. And we take a look further now to the WannaCry outbreak that occurred in 2017. Really, this was a very disruptive one. I'm sure we all remember when this occurred. This was also leveraging multiple different vulnerabilities that occurred, but now encrypting essentially everything on a device and demanding ransom out of it through Bitcoin. So Bitcoin now becoming more popular as a means for ransom. It essentially became very easily widespread at the time. So it was a very disruptive piece of malware. And as we shift forward now into 2020 and the 2020s era, we're seeing more things like supply chain attacks that are happening. The SolarWinds one is a great example where the software supply chain was essentially attacked itself, and that was leveraged essentially to install malware and backdoor capabilities. It unfortunately affected about 18,000 SolarWinds customers, including US government and major firms. And it resulted in quite a bad data breach as well too. So things shifting now more into the supply chain as well as part of this. When we take a look at the current landscape of malware, there's a couple of key trends that we're seeing. It's certainly increasing in its sophistication. Modern malware becoming more sophisticated. It's employing more advanced evasion techniques such as polymorphism, fileless attacks. I've even seen some zero-touch attacks as an example where you don't even need to touch anything. All of a sudden you're infected just by receiving this message. These attacks are becoming more targeted as well too. They're aiming for specific industries, individuals, organizations. A great example of some malware specifically targeting the healthcare industry as an example because they know that that's a particular weak spot in often cases. And we're also seeing a trend of malware as a service, this underground black market that's emerging where people can purchase malware to be done on their behalf. A great example is ransomware as a service where criminals can essentially order ransomware to be delivered to whatever target they want and reap the rewards and split the profit with whoever initiated that attack on their behalf. So these are becoming more sophisticated, more targeted, more accessible, and they're also becoming more frequent. I mean, this is just an example of from a few years ago, but the number of different vulnerabilities and attacks that are being leveraged against those vulnerabilities are rapidly increasing over time. And if we take a look at how security operation teams are facing this challenge, 51% of teams say that they're struggling to detect and investigate these advanced threats. 66% of them were affected by malware a few years ago. 55% of security teams say that critical alerts are being missed. You can read some of these statistics for yourself. There's a lot to it, but one important one, the average cost of a cybersecurity breach in 2023 was $4.5 million. Now, I know for a fact that, and I don't have the statistic up here right now, but when you increase your detection time, that number can go down, but as your systems and your organization becomes more complex, that dollar amount goes up as well too. So this is an increasingly growing problem, and if we take a look at the global cost of malware attacks by this year, we're looking at $10.5 trillion globally. So this is a huge business for the bad actors out there, and very important for all of us here to understand these pieces of malware and be able to effectively disrupt their attempts to disrupt us. So, this is obviously an important, costly thing. If we take a look again at the landscape for security teams, 62% of them, let's see here, 62% of incidents were committed by organized crime as an example. I'll let you read some of these statistics, but an important one is on the end there. 2,000%, 2x essentially, using manual flows is a lot more ineffective versus automated flows. So leveraging automation and technology to understand these things and detect these things is really what this is all about. That gives you an idea, though, of kind of the current malware landscape, where malware has come. We all have a base understanding now of malware. Let's actually dive into some of the different behaviors and techniques that many common pieces of malware use. So we kind of covered that chart initially, and let's dive into it a little bit further. We'll start with that initial compromise, and that can be done various different ways. It could be a phishing attempt. It could be a drive-by download where malware is downloaded and executed automatically when you visit a website. It could be done through exploiting vulnerabilities or malvertising, which is advertising done through malware. A great example of that, we got two up here. The first one is phishing. Hopefully you're not going to click on that link because that's going to take you to a bad place. That's not a legitimate PayPal email, unfortunately. But does anybody notice anything going on this screenshot on the right here? KeyPass, it's a popular tool. Would anybody click on that link? Good, nobody raised their hand, because if you actually were to take a look at that link a little bit closer, you'll see it's actually not KeyPass's website. It's using a different character there for the K, and essentially trying to trick somebody into clicking on that link instead of their actual website. So some of these malicious actors are buying ad space on Google, like you see right there, to essentially trick you, or whoever it may be, into downloading malware instead of legitimate software. Another tactic that a lot of malware uses is code obfuscation. So this can be done various different ways, but ultimately the idea of this is to obscure the source code to make it difficult for somebody who's looking at it to understand what this is doing. It could be done through encryption as an example, so encrypting the source code in a way where you can't read it. It can be done through encoding, like base64 encoding as an example. There's a lot of different ways. Polymorphism is another one where the code actually changes on its own and changes its behavior every time that it's run and executed to that way trip up any kind of detection system or static scanning that may be occurring. So there's a lot of different ways that it's doing this. This is an example here where this essentially decodes to that piece of code over there. So when you look at this, this looks a bit like gibberish. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But when you've de-obfuscated it, it's actually clear that this is actually a piece of malware that is trying to do something malicious. So it's a lot of interesting ways that they can try to cover their tracks. They also, one common thing that malware oftentimes does too is persistence. So it wants to maintain a foothold in an organization inside of a system for as long as possible. And there's various different ways that it can do that. One is through modifying registry keys. It could be setting up cron jobs and tasks as an example, SSH key abuse, or installing rootkits. These are all different ways that malware is able to set up persistence. And in this particular, we got a couple examples here. One's of a registry key that's been modified. And this one down here is a cron job that was set up to essentially initiate a reverse shell every minute to a remote host. So that's a way for somebody to then maintain their foothold and access that particular system that is compromised on a regular basis. Lateral movement is also a common pattern and behavior of malware. It's really trying to do things like abuse remote desktop as an example, SSH. It's trying to move laterally, maybe access credentials from somewhere so it can access other additional systems. This worm-like behavior can be very common in malware. In this particular example here, it's essentially scanning the network, looking for different hosts, and for each host, it's going to try to open up a thread and exploit that host in its own unique way to gain access to it and spread further. Command and control is also a very common one as well. This is the ability essentially for somebody remotely to communicate back to that system and give it instructions, give that malware instructions on what to do. There's lots of different ways that it can do this, leveraging HTTP and HTTPS as an example. DNS is another one. A very interesting one, though, is social media platforms. So I've seen malware where it actually is looking out to Twitter on a regular basis to a specific Twitter account. And when that Twitter account posts a new tweet, that tweet actually contains instructions for what that malware needs to do next. So it's very kind of clever how you can leverage a system like Twitter to be command and control server essentially for you and communicate out to these clients. Data exfiltration, also very common. There's lots of different ways that data can be exfiltrated. Key logging is one example, screen capturing, file exfiltration using things like HTTP or FTP. In this particular example, it's actually using DNS to exfiltrate data. So it's got essentially a malicious DNS server here. This is owned by the malicious person, and it's doing a DNS lookup for this particular web address. But this is actually essentially a base64 encoded string that is essentially containing a bit of data. So they'll make they'll essentially take the data, encode it, and make a bunch of these little queries and then stitch that data back together, and now they have their exfiltrated data. And they're leveraging DNS to do this to try to avoid detection and make it seem like it's just a normal DNS queries that are going on the network. A couple more to cover for you, destruction and disruption. So this can be things like ransomware encryption, data wiping, denial of service. Really, this is just essentially trying to destroy things, disrupt, cause as much harm as possible. Maybe you don't have a particular end goal, or maybe you do and you want to leverage it to hold a ransom. That's where that destruction and disruption technique can come into play. And evasion techniques, another one as well too, ultimately trying to cover your tracks. In this particular example here, it's trying to determine if something is a VM or not based off of the disk size of it. And if it's got a very small disk size, this piece of malware thinks that it's a VM and it's not going to execute essentially. But there's essentially other ways that it can try to do evasion as well, such as log deletion, delaying execution. Lots of different ways there, but this is just one example. So that covers some common techniques and behaviors. And let's take a look at an actual piece of ransomware here, the Ryuk Ransomware. This was first observed in 2018. It's believed to be associated with a criminal group linked to Russian cybercrime. And it was very disruptive. I mean, it took hundreds of thousands and to millions of dollars of Bitcoin essentially in its process. And we'll kind of cover a little bit of that here right now. But to give you an idea of the attack chain of this malware, it really started with a phishing email. When you opened up that link, it was essentially a doc that ran a macro which launched a PowerShell script. That PowerShell script first downloaded Emotet, so it's leveraging another piece of malware initially first. Emotet then grabs and deploys some additional pieces of malware, such as TrickBot. It pulls that in and leverages that to essentially disable antivirus services, harvest data, steal credentials, and then the command and control piece that it communicates with through those different pieces of malware then pulls down the Ryuk ransomware virus itself, and from there does the encryption and the ransom process. So it really starts with that dropper. When you click on that link, that's where it begins. It contains a 32 or 64-bit payload depending on the system that you're using. So it'll actually use the is-wow64 process API to determine if it's a 32 or 64-bit system. It'll also determine whether or not it's Windows XP or Windows Vista or later, and then act appropriately according to that. But once it essentially triggers that process, it runs into a shell and executes some additional commands. So it tries to create persistence, essentially by utilizing a very common registry key. So it creates a new value for that registry key, and it sets it to be executed on a regular basis. So that way, when you just turn off your system, it's able to run on a consistent basis there. Once it's established that persistence, it's going to try to use some common functionality to escalate its privileges. So it uses an adjust token privileges function to essentially modify the process and the security access token that it has available to it. And it tries to set its permissions to this SE debug privilege. So that's actually a privilege on a Windows host that has a bit more elevated privileges than your standard user, and it's trying to leverage that essentially. Intended purpose of it is to allow for debugging and memory adjustments of processes owned by other accounts, but it uses that in a particularly malicious way. So That's actually one that's commonly used by malware as well too for process injection. But that's what this Ryuk ransomware is also using here. And once it has that permissions, it then does its process injection. So it enumerates through the different processes that exist on that particular host. Once it finds its selected one, it essentially attempts to set the SE debug permissions, privileges rather, to adjust that to insert a process into there. So it's using the open process API, it's retrieving kind of what the current payload it is, and it's actually allocating the exact memory necessary to that specific process to run and inject itself into that process so it has enough memory, is essentially inserting itself into an existing running process, if that makes sense, and runs inside of there to ultimately avoid detection. So very sophisticated way of doing it. In the process though as well, it also goes and kills a bunch of other processes. So that could be things like antivirus software as an example. It really iterates through and essentially just takes, it kills 40 different processes, 180 different services. It's looking for things that could disrupt itself and ultimately detect it. So it's going through, it's using these net commands, SC commands, task kill, killing all of these different things, starting its essentially its disruptive process. So it'll begin by killing those processes. Then it'll also go a step further and delete backups as well too. So many Windows hosts have shadow backups that are occurring on them on a regular basis. The Ryuk ransomware is actually going to go through and delete all of those, so that way you can't effectively back it up, and you're more likely going to have to be forced to either pay that ransomware or just give up on that system as a whole. So it deletes those backups, then it begins the encryption process. So it uses a multi-threaded encryption process, so it's incredibly fast. It's handling each file individually in its own thread. So it moves very, very quickly. There are certain types of files that it does try to avoid, like certain executables as an example, but it tries to encrypt everything else. It uses 256-bit AES keys for each file, and it essentially splits it up into chunks of 1,000,000 bytes each. So each of these is being kind of chunked up a little bit based off of those 1,000,000 bytes. And interestingly enough, I don't know if you can see this very well, but right here, it says the string Hermes. That's actually a unique signature for the Ryuk ransomware. And it puts that little kind of key metadata tag at the beginning of each of these encrypted files. So if you are compromised and you take a look and try to crack open one of those files and you see that Hermes line at the beginning of it, that's a good indication that this is the Ryuk ransomware. Not only does it encrypt files on your system, it also tries to go out, communicate with network shares, and encrypt files on those as well too. So it's not just disruptive to your system, but anything else that it's connected to, it's going to try to go out there, have that kind of lateral movement worm-like behavior, and encrypt and do as much damage as possible. Lastly, before it gets to that ransom note, it establishes command and control functions using HTTPS to communicate back. It doesn't communicate as often as some other pieces of malware do. This is by design to ultimately try to avoid detection as much as possible. And once you've done all that, you now have your ransom note here. This is essentially going to tell you, you got to pay Bitcoin to this particular address here if you want these things to be decrypted in time. So that's really kind of how this piece of malware works and how it kind of leverages its different phases and behaviors over time to get to its end goal, which is to extort you for money. So how do you defend against these particular types of malware? This one in particular, patching your system is a great first step, making sure that you don't have the vulnerabilities on your system to be able to have that exploited. Network segmentation is also a good idea as well, because if you have a segmented network, that's going to mean that things are less likely to spread across to other systems. Having strong backup strategies is also important, leveraging multi-factor authentication, and having a good endpoint detection and response solution. Now, Cisco does have a couple tools for malware analysis. I'm going to breeze through this fairly quickly because we're getting short on time. But the first one is Cisco Secure Endpoint. This runs on your endpoints and is a great way to detect malware. One of the unique things about this is that it does have Cisco Malware Analytics on it. So it can essentially analyze malware and tell you if any piece of software is malicious or not. Very valuable tool to have. It'll do things like static and dynamic analysis of particular files as well. Cisco Secure Email is another useful tool. Many pieces of malware start with the phishing email, so having a strong email solution can help you in your strategy to defend against malware. This will also leverage, do things like URL reputation scanning, file analysis, looking for malware. Cisco Secure Network Analytics is another one as well too. You can detect things like reconnaissance that are occurring in it, command and control behaviors, data exfiltration, very valuable tool. And one last one I'll mention is XDR. This is for extended detection and response. A very valuable tool as well. It leverages Talos as well as some of these other tools do. Combines all of these tools that I've mentioned earlier into a singular platform to do and manage your detection and response when malware events occur. And you can get all these things together, fortunately enough, in Cisco's breach protection suite. They all come bundled up together there, making it really easy to have a strong defensive posture against malware. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do appreciate you all today. We did cover quite a bit very quickly, going into malware, covering kind of what it is and the history of it, going into what some of the common behaviors and tactics of it are, as well as actually taking a look at some of the source code for an individual piece of malware. If you're interested more in ethical hacking and how malware works, I highly recommend that you check out the Cisco Certificate in Ethical Hacking. It's available, a free course of about 70 hours of content on Cisco Networking Academy. That's netacad.com. And you can learn a lot about red team activities. The course itself is free. For a couple bucks more though, beyond free, you can access these capture the flag challenges and be able to get a certificate in ethical hacking from Cisco that's valid for the rest of your career. So I highly recommend that you check that out. I highly recommend that you also check out the Cisco Breach Protection Suite, as well as Cisco U, the namesake of our theater here. It's a great learning platform to learn about these different types of things. We've got free tutorials on there as well. It's free to sign up, so you can learn all sorts of different things on there as well too. But I want to thank you all for your time today. If you get a chance, please fill out the session survey. You get this awesome limited edition Amsterdam t-shirt here if you do 4 surveys. But more importantly for me, your feedback is very appreciative, so I can improve this session over time and make it better for all of you as well. So feel free to continue your education, check out the demos, capture the flag, have a great time here at Cisco Live, and enjoy the celebration tonight too. Thank you.